Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I am pleased to be rising in the House today. So the motion we are debating today, the Conservatives have their Opposition Day motion, and they have decided to present the House with the following motion, and I quote, that the House call on the unelected Senate to immediately pass Bill C-234, an act to amend the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act to remove the carbon tax on the farmers that feed Canadians as passed by the democratically elected House. So essentially, today's debate is on a motion to try and get a Conservative private member's bill through the Senate. And I'm amazed because, Conservatives today are acting with outrage that the Senate isn't moving quickly enough, and it's as if they haven't done far worse in moving bills slowly in the past. I mean, the cognitive dissonance, the absence of any historical grounding in today's debate is absolutely shocking. And when I was thinking of my remarks for today's speech, two words came to mind: irony and hypocrisy. Because at best, Madam Speaker, we could be talking of the irony of this moment, but I think this is just plain and simple hypocrisy. Because I do believe the Conservatives are actually self-aware, and they know exactly of their entirety of their sordid history with the Senate. You see, irony is about highlighting the human relationship with reality. It kind of teases out the inconsistencies that reside in all of us, but this is far more than inconsistency, Madam Speaker. Hypocrisy is simple. It's about, contradicting ourselves, but with a more forceful and deliberate vein, because it is quite simply, hypocrisy is the pretense of consistency to hide one's inconsistency. And today's motion, if you look at the history of Conservative relationships with senators, is definitely one of inconsistency. So again, I am absolutely flabbergasted at the sheer audacity of the Conservative Party of Canada coming to this House today to lecture members of Parliament and the Canadian public on the Senate. And I will get into that in far greater detail as I use my remarks today, Mr. Speaker.
Please do.
But first of all, I want to start on Bill C-234. And it's important to acknowledge that that bill was duly passed by a vote of 176 to 146 in the House of Commons earlier this year. And it is also equally important, Mr. Speaker, to note that that bill would not have passed this House if it were not for all opposition parties giving their support. That included the Green Party, the Bloc Québécois, and the NDP. There were also 3 Liberals that lent their support to that bill. So the electoral math in this place shows that those kind of numbers are needed for any bill. And I want to highlight that fact because often when I hear Conservative speeches, they tend to conveniently leave that little fact out. And I think it's also important in today's debate that we are not here to relitigate Bill C-234. That has been done by the House. That bill went through second reading. It went through the Standing Committee at Agriculture and Agri-Food, of which I have been a proud member for the last 6 years. I was present for those meetings. I listened to the witnesses. I participated in the clause-by-clause review of the bill, the amendment of the bill, the reporting of the bill back to the House, and its third reading. So again, the House has voiced its opinion on the matter. A clear majority of MPs decided to pass it, and we don't need to be spending our time talking about what has actually been done. At the time, Mr. Speaker, I highlighted my support for that bill because I actually thought that the provisions in the bill were consistent with the act it's trying to amend, namely the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, which was passed by a majority Liberal government back in 2018. If one takes a careful reading of the parent act, you will see there are exemptions listed in the act for qualifying farm fuels, for farm machinery, for farming activities. And after my careful consideration of this bill, of listening to the many farm groups that appeared before our committee, I agreed with them. There are no commercially viable alternatives to using propane and natural gas for certain farm activities, and I thought that this amendment was quite in line with the original document that Liberal drafters had put together. And, so again, we have done our due diligence on this bill. I don't think we need to be spending too much time dwelling on C-234. And, I was quite happy with the amendments that were made to C-234, the committee stage. Narrowing its focus so that there's more clarity on specifically on what it's going to be applied to, and also introducing a sunset clause so that it's a signal to the industry that there's a narrow window of time to start developing commercially viable alternatives. And I know from witness testimony that those efforts are well underway. Again, it's a price signal, sending a signal to the markets that they need to step up their game. But, I think I've had the honor of spending, as I mentioned, 6 years on the Agriculture Committee. And one thing I have heard consistently from our farmers is that they are on the front lines of climate change. They're the ones who are dealing with the shifting weather patterns that is caused by fossil fuel-driven climate change. And when entire crops fail, whether it be from a drought or a flood, the shortage of feed like we had in many parts of British Columbia due to drying up water sources, this is now the norm in many parts of Western Canada, and it's only going to get worse in the years ahead. Anyone with a simple knowledge of scientific fact can see that this situation is going to get worse. And so, when I hear my Conservative colleagues talking about support for farmers, I try to put that in conjunction with their support for the oil and gas industry, or how should I say this, their lack of effort in going after the intense corporate profits of the oil and gas sector, which are, of course, fueling the planet burning right now. So again, there is a dichotomy there where my Conservative friends will like to say, well, we stand on the side of our farmers, and meanwhile farmers are telling us the greatest threat to their livelihood is in fact climate change, and I don't see any viable policy alternatives to actually addressing that fact. But enough on that, Mr. Speaker. Let's get to the real heart of the matter today, the Senate. So Canadians, of course, do have legitimate questions about the Senate. In Canada's Parliament, of course, we have a bicameral system. We have here the lower house, the elected House of Commons, and we also have an appointed Senate. And if you are one of the lucky few to get selected for the senator position, well, guess what, Mr. Speaker? You have a locked-in job until age 75. You never have to face the electorate. And, you get to enjoy all of the trappings that office has, but with none of the accountability. See, I, like every member of Parliament of this place, I have to reapply for my job every certain number of years. I have to be accountable for the votes I take, for the speeches I make, for the policy positions I take, because that is the heart of democracy. I'm not just here by myself. I'm here representing an entire riding of Cowichan, Malahat, Langford, and those are the people I report to, and I have reported to them through 3 federal elections. Senators don't have to do that. And only a handful of democracies around the world have an appointed upper chamber. And I think many Canadians who are listening to today's debate would agree with me that in a modern, functional, 21st century democracy, an appointed upper house with all of the nominal powers of the lower house has no room in this kind of a system. The system we have has been begging for reform for many, many years. And, the NDP's position on the Senate is quite well known. We have certainly called for its abolishment. We note that there are many countries around the world who do quite well with just one single chamber of elected representatives. Other places have indirect elections or have direct elections for their senators. And whatever system, at least those senators are accountable to the people they serve, unlike our upper body. And this is an important context for today's debate, because ultimately what we're doing here in the lower house is complaining about the appointed upper chamber thwarting the democratic will of the House of Commons. And this is a moment in time, but it has to be placed in the context of history, because this is not the first time that it's happened. And I also want to underline this, Mr. Speaker. I do have a good working relationship with a handful of senators. Many who serve on the Agriculture Committee, I've had the pleasure of getting to know them and their work, and I do not question their commitment to their line of work. My comments today are based solely on the Senate as an institution and the inherent contradictions it has in a 21st century democracy. But now, Mr. Speaker, let's go to, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, the Conservative hypocrisy and the Senate. Now, I agree with them that they have the right idea in today's motion in calling on the Senate to quit delaying the passage of a bill, in this case C-234. We in the NDP have called on the Senate to do this many times over our history. So this is well-trodden ground for us. And I'd like to welcome my Conservative friends to the club.
Hear, hear.
They may not be used to this, but trust me, as New Democrats, we have a long history in calling for this. But again, for them to bring in today's motion, given their history, is quite something. And I really want to underline that for Canadians who are watching today's debate. It's a fact in this place, Mr. Speaker, that both Conservatives and Liberals have a sordid history with the Senate. They have both been guilty of not only appointing failed candidates, loyal donors, and party operatives, but they have used, yes, my colleague over here used the term bagman. That's absolutely a legitimate term. But they have used that appointed and unelected body to block bills from the democratically elected House. And one only needs to look at our parliamentary history to see this is not a one-off situation. It's happened many times, and to watch Conservatives and Liberals point fingers at each other just goes to show that ultimately, when it comes to this issue, these two parties are but different sides of the same coin. Now, this Conservative Party, let's take a little walk down the lane of history, Mr. Speaker. This is the party of Mike Duffy and Nigel Wright. And for the leader of the Conservative Party, the member for Carleton, to stand in this place and give us a lecture on the Senate, when this is the person, when he was in government, was a representative of former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, had to day in, day out defend the Chief of Staff, Nigel Wright, giving a $90,000 check to Mike Duffy because of living expenses. Like, that's what the member for Carleton had to stand up in this place and do time and time again.
Selective amnesia.
And we do have selective amnesia in this place. I thank the member for Courtney Alberni on referencing that, because we do lose sight of our history in this place. And the member for Carleton, he's been an MP for 19 years, 19 very long years. And I know the Conservatives have spent millions of dollars on burnishing up his image, but he has a long history in this House of Commons. And I think if we do some digging, there's a lot of comments, a lot of questions, a lot of speeches from the member for Carleton that will give the truth to who he really is. But it gets better, Mr. Speaker, because the Conservatives have stood in this place accusing Liberals of bullying senators and imposing their will, when the Conservative Party is the only party in this House that still has 15 senators that caucus with it every Wednesday. 15 Conservative senators join with their MP counterparts for every Wednesday meeting, and they get their marching orders from the member for Carleton on how to play games in the Senate.
True.
This has been the case for several parliaments, and we have seen it in the past. Conservative senators, they have taken their marching orders from former Prime Minister Harper, and they have done the very thing that Conservatives are mad about today with C-234. They took their marching orders from the Conservative Party in the House of Commons, and they used their procedural shenanigans in the Red Chamber to block multiple bills on multiple occasions that were passed by the Democratic House. Again, Mr. Speaker, rank hypocrisy from the Conservatives. And I will outline a few notable examples. So our former dear beloved leader, Jack Layton, several parliaments ago, had a bill that was passed from the House called the Climate Change Accountability Act. And my God, how things would be different now if we had actually paid attention back then, passed that law. But right now in 2023, of course, we're dealing with the consequences of years of inaction from both Liberal and Conservative governments. And that bill, Mr. Speaker, was held up. It died in the Senate because of procedural shenanigans instigated by Conservative senators. We've also had other cases, former NDP member of Parliament Paul Dewar, who represented Ottawa Centre. He introduced Bill C-393. It was a bill to, foment the shipment of generic drugs, the provision of generic drugs to Africa. A worthy cause, but again, it died in the Senate because of Conservative Senator procedural shenanigans. And then, of course, in the 42nd Parliament, a bill that brought us to where we are today, the bill that was introduced to fully implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a groundbreaking piece of legislation, Bill C-262, that was ahead of its time, ahead of where the puck was going, and I think directly led to the government introducing its own legislation in the subsequent Parliament and making sure that Canada's federal laws are in harmony with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That bill, duly passed by the House of Commons in the 42nd Parliament, and because of procedural shenanigans and games by Conservative senators at the request of their leader, was held up. And actually, Mr. Speaker, this is the amazing thing about the Senate. We can't do that here in the House. The rules there, one senator can throw in a wrench and jam up the entire works for days on end. And they use this tactic again and again and again. So again, Conservative senators under orders from their leader doing precisely the same thing that Conservatives are mad about today when it comes to their own legislation. So these are the things we have to highlight, Mr. Speaker. They're incredibly important because, again, we have short memories in this place. So I know, Mr. Speaker, that I'm coming down to my final 3 minutes, and I'll very much look forward to the questions that come. But again, I think it does us well to understand that, first of all, Bill C-234 would not have passed this place if it were not for all opposition parties working together to pass it because they saw merit in the bill. So that's number one. Number two, we fundamentally agree with the principle that the Senate, as an unelected body, needs to respect the will of the House. The only party that's been consistent on that position through several parliaments is the NDP. We're the only party here who comes out squeaky clean in a debate about the Senate. And I think all members could do well to acknowledge that fact. Consistent with our third reading vote on Bill C-234, we will be voting in favor of today's motion because that is consistent with the approach that we have always taken. Had there been motions on our own private members' bills from several parliaments past, we would have done the same thing. And I think it is important to remind senators that, we're the ones who have to go and face the electorate. We're the ones who are conveying the wishes of the people of Canada, and every seat in this place here represents a distinct geographic area of Canada. We're the ones who are bringing the voice of the people here, and senators need to be reminded of that fact. But I will end by saying that, I again have to highlight the hypocrisy. I know I like serving with many of my Conservative colleagues, but as a party, we cannot be taking any moral lessons from them on the Senate, not given their history with appointing failed candidates, party bagmen, with the instructions they give to their 15 caucus members who are members of the Senate, with the entire history they have of blocking bills. I think Canadians who are listening to today's debate need to understand that the last place you would ever go to for a moral lesson on the problems with the Senate is the Conservative Party of Canada. Okay? So I just want to make that very clear. Now, I'm in my last minute, Mr. Speaker, so I think I'll do well to end my remarks there. I thank everyone for taking the time to listen, and I look forward to any questions or comments.
Good job.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the honourable member for Lambton, Middlesex, London. No. Lambton, Kent, Middlesex. I don't know why I always had that challenge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for his impassioned speech. But there is something I would disagree with on him, and that is, Conservatives, Mr. Speaker, have been standing up for farmers nonstop. I come from a very heavy grain area where my farmers right now are telling me that their corn is coming in at 30% moisture, 28% moisture, and they need to get their corn dried down to 13%, 15%. Well, guess what? You have to use natural gas or propane in order to dry the grain because guess what? There is no other commercially viable option to dry grain in such huge amounts. And in Northern Ontario, we have grain farms that are 20,000 acres, 15,000 acres, as much like the prairies. And we have senators in the Senate who are stalling this legislation who are from Northern Ontario who should know that the cost is exuberant for these farmers to dry their grain. So I'm wondering if my colleague could comment, Mr. Speaker, on why these senators from Northern Ontario should not be held accountable by the constituents that they are supposed to represent, and why Canadians should not be able to call their senators to voice their concerns.
The honourable member for Cowichan, Malahat Langford.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I mean, all good points. That's why I voted for the bill. We understood very clearly from committee hearings on this bill that there are no commercially viable alternatives. And you know, I would say that those problems with drying grain, with getting appropriate levels of feed because of future droughts, those problems, as I said in my speech, are going to multiply because this is the new reality that our farmers are facing. And I would say it's not just Conservatives who support farmers. One of the reasons why the Agriculture Committee gets along so well is because all parties around that table understand that they have farmers as constituents. And I think it's the only committee of the House of Commons that regularly works and makes decisions by consensus. But again, I would argue with the one point, though. Senators don't have constituents. We have constituents. And I acknowledge it's a problem. I don't agree that the Senate should be holding up a bill. But I gave countless examples of where Conservative senators did the exact same thing for other bills. And that's the hypocrisy that people need to understand when it comes to the Conservative Party. Senators should not be doing this. They should be listening to the democratic will of the House. I just simply wish that the Conservatives would have a consistent position no matter what bill is being discussed in the Senate.
I'm just sort of wondering why we couldn't use the air in here to dry grain. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Because there's not enough Conservative speakers standing, Mr. Speaker, that breathe a lot of hot air. But Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, you know, it is an interesting bill. But I would suggest that the member maybe give some thought in regards to the bail reform bill. The bail reform bill, if the member will recall, back in, I guess, sometime in June, Conservative leaders said, hey, this is really important stuff. We got to pass this. In fact, we should come back into session in order to get that particular bill passed. And then we do come back in session in September. We actually passed the bill unanimously through the whole process. Today, it's being actually held up still. It hasn't passed because of the Conservative Party. And here we have the Conservatives now saying, well, let's pass this bill. They seem to have forgotten this really other important piece of legislation, which has wide spectrum of support and all different stakeholders, and every member of the chamber is actually supportive. I'm wondering if he sees any irony there, why it is they're being very selective in terms of raising on the floor. Why not the bail bill?
The honourable member for Cowichan, Malahat Langford.
Well, you know, that's a great question, Mr. Speaker. You know, I know the Conservatives have suddenly taken it upon themselves to have a greater interest in the beautiful Vancouver Island area. But I would remind them that in my riding of Cowichan, Malahat Langford, every single municipality I represent wrote to me and asked that that bill get passed quickly. And I'm sure it's the same up and down Vancouver Island and in many communities right across Canada. So yes, again, I think it goes to the theme of the hypocrisy of where, you know, there is a selective memory in this place of how different parties have used the Senate to further their own ends or block an opposing party's piece of legislation. So I agree with my colleague from across the way, the member for Winnipeg North. That's an important bill. I was proud to support it. I was proud to see how we all came together because the municipalities in Cowichan, Malahat Langford, mayors and council from every single town wrote to me, urged me to pass that piece of legislation quickly. I'm glad I was able to report back as their member of parliament, something that senators don't have to do. I was able to report back to them that the House did its job, and I would like to see the Senate recognize and respect that fact.
Question commentaire à l'honorable.
The honourable member for Saint Jean. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague from Chin Malahat Langford for his speech, which I greatly appreciated. Almost everything except for one little bit, saying that the NDP was the only party in favor of abolishing the Senate. I'd like to remind him also, it's also the Bloc's position. And on this specific point, which I find somewhat sad, is that unlike the Bloc, which is predictable in its decision-making process, therefore, the people who elect us know why they're doing that, and they know what decision we're going to make in the House. The Conservatives only make a decision when it suits them. In terms of C-234, this is the case, but we can also talk about another bill, C-282, which was there to protect supply management. The Conservatives do the exact opposite. It's what they're criticizing us. They're accusing us of slowing this legislation down. With the Conservatives, if they're able to plug carbon tax somewhere, it'll be a tool to vote against something. They make particularly strange decisions. For example, they vote against a bill for a free trade deal with Ukraine. So I'd like to hear what my colleague has to say about this. Is it not sad for Canadians, this lack of rigor, this cherry picking, which doesn't allow those who elected the Conservatives to know where they're going with their decision? The honourable member.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and allow me to withdraw the comment and apologize. I want to recognize that the Bloc absolutely is in line with the NDP in abolishing the upper chamber. And she's right, you know, in addition to C-234, a very important bill that we were proud to support, Bill C-282. I have a lot of supply managed farmers in my riding who personally met with me. I met with many of their industry groups. And we were proud to support that piece of legislation because we simply cannot trust Liberal and Conservative governments to honor the spirit of supply management. And so we agreed with the Bloc Québécois in putting that in legislation so that we could prevent future governments from negotiating away our supply managed industries. I mean, I want to give another shout out. The member for York Simcoe has Bill C-280 in the Senate. And I hope that the Senate will respect the will of the House, because that's another important bill dealing with the Canadian Produce Marketing Association, the fresh fruit and vegetable sector. So again, strong agricultural bills coming from the House of Commons. And I think one thing that Canadians deserve of us is to have consistency in our positions. If you look at the Conservative history at the Senate, it has been anything but consistent.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Mr. Speaker, the issue of Conservative hypocrisy in the Senate is one of the reasons that the Canadian people threw Brian Mulroney out and gave him the bum's rush after he imposed 8 senators to force through the most hated tax of all time, the GST. And Canadians were stuck paying for these dudes until they were 75. They can't be fired. I mean, the price of a Conservative sock puppet is enormous. And then so Stephen Harper came in and said he was going to reform the Senate. And what did he do? Well, I mean, it's just one long list of pals and cronies. Let's talk about Larry Smith. Now, Larry Smith gets appointed to the Senate, and he's outraged when he finds out how much money he's going to make. He says it's a, quote, dramatic, catastrophic pay cut that he had to serve the Canadian people. This is how I want to touch this guy. So then he runs for office. Now, needless to say, the Canadian people want nothing to do with Larry Smith, so he comes in third. This man is unfit for public service. Stephen Harper puts him back in. Loyal sock puppet. And we're stuck to this guy till he's 75. He can't be fired. He doesn't have to show up for work. All he has to do is be loyal to the Conservative Party. So when I see the member who's living in Stornoway in a 19-room mansion talking about the common people and the Senate, I'm amazed. Doesn't he meet with them every week and know exactly how entitled and how out of touch and what cronies they are of the Conservative Party?
Before I move on, I just need to remind ourselves, Standing Order 18. And it quotes, "No member shall use offensive words against either house or against any member thereof." So I think the honourable member comes pretty close to impugning other members in the other house. So I just would remind folks to be judicious in their referral to honourable members of all our houses that represent Canadians. The honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
I really appreciate that. In that I don't actually deal with the unelected Senate on a regular basis. Is it crony or pal? Is there a particular term that I should be aware of?
Moving on to the next speech, the honourable member for Huron Bruce.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.